Welcome to another enlightening episode of The Truth About the Plant, the show that takes you on a journey through the world of psychoactive plants and alternative wellness, all while delivering real, actionable insights you crave. I'm your host, Christina Dees, and this is my equally talented co host, Dr. Amanda Ryman. Dr. Ryman, you want to tell them why we're here?
Why we're here? Well, this is our 41st episode. And we do this series because it can be so difficult to find good science backed information about cannabis on the internet. Everyone seems to have an opinion, and very rarely are those opinions based on fact or actual data or good information. So you might have a really important question about cannabis. You go online, you Google it, you get 100 different responses. Many of those are going to contradict each other. And so we're here to wade through the BS and basically to give you the truth in 15 minutes or less so that you can get the info you need and get on with your day. You can think of us as your really cool aunties or your kick-ass granddaughters, the women in your life who will always tell you the truth.
That's right. And today we are diving into a classification conundrum that's been buzzing in the brains of botanists, lawmakers, and couch philosophers alike. Why is cannabis hanging out in the VIP section of controlled substances as a Schedule 1 drug? It's time to weed out the facts from the fiction and get to the root of the high stakes classification. So pack your bowl of popcorn and let's blaze through this burning question. Why is cannabis a Schedule 1 drug? Well, there was a lot of discussion this summer about the possibility of moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And now that the public comment period is over, we wait for the next step. Recently the DEA announced that there will be a hearing, but not until December 2nd. So another year goes by. So while we're all waiting, let me ask you, Dr. Ryman, why was cannabis placed in Schedule 1, the category for the most addictive and dangerous drugs in the first place?
Well, a lot of times people think that drugs are scheduled or classified based on science, based on their actual risk, but this is not true. Drug policy, including the one that established the drug schedules, was always about demonizing certain groups of people who happen to use certain substances. And with the drug scheduling, it was no different. So the Controlled Substances Act was passed by then President Richard Nixon in the early 70s. And with it came this ranking system. So 5 schedules of drugs based on the criteria of whether they had any medical value, whether they were addictive, and how risky they were to use. And drugs that were in the Schedule 1 category, or the toughest schedule, were considered to have no medical value, a very high rate of addiction, and were too dangerous to use even under the care of a physician, whereas drugs in the Schedule 5 were a little bit more like, okay, this could possibly have some implications for addiction, but we're not too concerned about it. Things like cough medicine went into Schedule 5. So cannabis was put in Schedule 1, but the reasoning behind it was really to justify harsh penalties for users and sellers. It wasn't about cannabis being dangerous. It was about convincing the public that cannabis was dangerous, so that when they said we need to lock up people that are selling cannabis, we need to lock up people that are using cannabis, the public was more likely to buy into it.
Wow. So labeling cannabis as a dangerous drug was more about opening a pathway to arrest and incarcerate people who disagreed with the government or who fought for progressive issues like civil and women's rights.
Absolutely. So in the 1960s, there was a lot of social unrest happening. People wanted rights. They wanted to be treated like everyone else. They wanted to stop discrimination. They wanted to stop segregation. And this was a threat to the status quo. This was a threat to kind of the law and order government that had been in control through the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. And Nixon was really afraid of these folks. So he didn't invent the idea of using drug policy as social control. This is actually a very old idea that started in the late 1800s in San Francisco, of all places, who we think of as this liberal, bastion of progressive issues, was actually one of the first places in the country to implement drug laws, and it was against Chinese immigrants. So there was a large influx of Chinese immigration into San Francisco in the 1800s, and they brought with them their culture and their tradition and the substances that they used for relaxation, including opium. Now, the government thought that they couldn't just go after people just because they were Chinese. That would look really bad. But what they could do was pass laws against the use of opium that was used primarily by this one population that would give them an excuse to stop people, search them, detain them, basically take away their rights, not because they were Chinese, but because they were using this very dangerous drug. This came back into play in the early 1900s with Mexican immigration and cannabis, where a lot of laws around cannabis were really focused on wanting to control the population of Mexican immigrants. So Nixon was like, this might work. If I can take this substance, marijuana, that's being used by a lot of activists and people that are questioning the government and people that want rights and freedoms, and I can convince the public that it is a really, really dangerous drug and that anyone involved in it is a danger to society, they're really not going to say anything when I suggest that we lock these people up, when we take away their freedoms, because I have convinced them that this drug is dangerous and therefore the people who use it are also dangerous.
Yeah, and when you learn this information, it blows your mind to think that they used it as discrimination and then also a way to take away rights from people of color or immigrants, like you said. So, what is the process for getting a drug rescheduled?
Well, the official process is that the Department of Health and Human Services is basically makes the decision that they're going to review the evidence. Because again, there's still this claim that drugs are placed in certain schedules because of scientific evidence about them, right? So the Department of Health and Human Services says, we think that maybe this drug isn't as dangerous as we thought, or maybe it's more dangerous than we thought. So we're going to open up a process of reviewing the evidence and the scientific literature around this drug. And then we're going to make a recommendation about what schedule this drug should be in. The DEA then either accepts or rejects that recommendation. And if they accept it and the White House signs off on it, then we have this public comment period where people can write in and talk about their views on what should happen with this drug. And then the DEA makes a final ruling. And they're either going to say, we're going to keep it in the same schedule or we're going to move it to some other schedule. And so that's really the process. Now, cannabis is in this weird position because one of the characteristics of a Schedule 1 drug is that it has no medical benefit and is extremely harmful. And what that means is that since cannabis was put in Schedule 1, there was very, very little opportunity to do any kind of research on the benefits of cannabis. Because it's like, hey, we've already decided it has no benefits. So why would we give you money to study the benefits? And shortly after cannabis was put in Schedule 1 in the 1970s, the Nixon administration actually commissioned a scientific study of cannabis with the public persona being, well, maybe it doesn't belong in Schedule 1. Maybe I was wrong. Let's just put it there, just in the meantime. And then I'm going to have these scientists come back and give me an official recommendation. So he did that. The commission was called the Schaefer Commission. They reviewed all the evidence. They came back and said, Dick Nixon, not only should cannabis not be Schedule 1, but we don't even think that the personal use of cannabis rises to the level of criminal activity. And Nixon was like, thank you very much. I'm going to completely ignore that and keep cannabis in Schedule 1. So shortly after that happened, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws was enacted. And their whole thing was defending the rights of cannabis consumers, saying we are not criminals. This is not a criminal act. We don't pose a threat to society. And they actually started filing petitions to the federal government to examine cannabis scheduling and to say, look, it doesn't belong in Schedule 1. So this went on for decades. Every time the Department of Health and Human Services would come back and say, there just isn't enough evidence and research on cannabis for us to even open the case. Like there isn't enough for us to even review, so we're not going to do it. Americans for Safe Access, which was founded over 20 years ago, they started filing petitions. But every single time the Department of Health and Human Services would come back and say, well, cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug. It has no medical benefit. Therefore, there is no research on it. Therefore, we can't look at the research. Therefore, we're not going to reschedule. And that's kind of the doom loop that we've been in ever since the 1970s.
I am so glad you brought up the Schedule One status, making it hard to research any potential therapeutic value of cannabis. Um, you know, what change resulted in HHS finally agreeing to review the evidence and making a scheduling recommendation, a rescheduling recommendation?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it was really two things. One is the research started to emerge. So, as much as the National Institute on Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse was not funding research on the benefits of cannabis for decades and decades, you started to see state programs that were generating tax revenue from cannabis legalization fund research through their own universities. So, in California, for example, there's a grant every year that goes out to public universities in the state to conduct research on cannabis. We started to see other countries legalize cannabis for medical use and start their own research programs. And then in the last several years or so, the National Institute of Health has also started to fund research looking at the potential medical benefits of cannabis. So the amount of research on cannabis since legalization and medical use has taken off has grown exponentially in the past decade or so. We're also seeing a lot more clinical programs and academic programs focused on cannabis as a therapeutic tool. You were a graduate of one of them. And so it really started to bring into the mainstream this idea that medical professionals could study cannabis, that they could support the medical use of cannabis, and that there was something behind that other than just their patients telling them that it worked. So that was one thing. But even if all that was out there, if the Department of Health and Human Services didn't say, yes, there's enough for us to look at, we wouldn't have had this. And so the second really important piece of this was Javier Becerra. And he is the secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. He was formerly the top prosecutor in the state of California. And so he was the attorney general of the state of California. And so he came from a state that over 20, 30 years ago had already accepted that cannabis had medical value. And, he's quoted as saying, we didn't used to have the research, but we have it now. Like it exists now. And so my department is going to be directed to review the research. So because more research existed and because you had someone in charge that recognized that and that was willing to direct his department to oversee that process, you then had the HHS come back and make a recommendation to move cannabis to Schedule 3. The DEA begrudgingly accepted, but not really endorsed that recommendation. We had the public comment period, and that brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, and also you pointed out because of all of this research that's happening and the head of the HHS, there's a lot more programs wrapping cannabis into medical education and pharmacy, like the program that I completed at Thomas Jefferson University, and I know that the University of Maryland also has one as well. So what happens now? We just wait?
Kind of, yeah. So, hey, we've been waiting since 1971. So yes, now we wait for the next step. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, the DEA has recently requested an administrative hearing, which is going to be, like a public hearing on December 2nd, full of experts that are going to kind of argue both sides. And then the DEA will come back with a recommendation. And that recommendation can be keep it in Schedule 1. It can be move it to Schedule 3, or it can be move it to Schedule 2. There's a lot of prohibitionist groups out there that are saying, well, maybe it doesn't need to be in Schedule 1, but Schedule 3 is way too permissive. You have advocacy groups out there saying it should be out of the Controlled Substances Act completely, but I don't see that.
Well, anything else that you want to add?
Well, I mean, one last thing I'll say is that cannabis should not be in the Controlled Substances Act. I mean, if we were looking at this today for the first time, alcohol is not in the Controlled Substances Act. Tobacco is not in the Controlled Substances Act. Like cannabis does not rise to the level of harm, certainly if alcohol and tobacco do not, to even be a controlled substance. So I do agree that it does not belong in the Controlled Substances Act. However, our government does not like to admit that it's wrong, and it especially does not like to admit that it was completely wrong. So to go from saying cannabis is the most dangerous, no medical value, highly addictive category to, oh, we're just kidding. It doesn't belong here at all. I, that's just not the kind of government we have. I mean, there's this level of authority where they might say, look, we know more now, so we're willing to say that it does have some medical value and it shouldn't be as restricted as Schedule 1. But this is not the end of the road. This is step one on a long path to making cannabis regulated the way that it actually fits, given the science and what we know about potential harm.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And I think what you're saying is educate yourselves. That's the most important thing. And that's why we're here to bring all of that education to our viewers and our listeners. Well, that's a wrap on today's deep dive into cannabis classification. If you're still burning with questions about Schedule 1 or you just want to chat about things green, feel free to drop us a line at info@mypersonalplants.com. If you've got questions that you want answered on the show, we love those too. So don't forget to check out the YouTube channel for more plant-powered wisdom. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, the notification bell, give us a like, all that while you're there. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, whether it's Schedule 1, 2, or none of the above, knowledge is the real high that we're after here at The Truth About the Plant. So keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you on the next episode.